Recording in progress.
Welcome to the City Council special meeting this Monday evening on October 16th. I now call this meeting to order. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
With pleasure, Mayor. Councilmember Hedges?
Yes, here.
Councilmember Lorraine?
Here.
Councilmember Newsom? Here. Deputy Mayor Diaz-Nash?
Here.
Mayor Lee?
Here.
Thank you.
We're excited to be here in person with options for those who choose not to be in person to participate virtually. There are several ways to participate. For those attending in person, complete the yellow request to speak slip and hand it to the clerk. If participating remotely, use the raise your hand feature in Zoom and you will be called upon at the appropriate time. If calling in via phone, press *9 to raise your hand and you will be called upon. When called upon, press *6 to unmute. These options for public comment will remain available until I close the public comment period for each specific item. We'll begin with the first item on the special meeting agenda, which is a closed session on conference with labor negotiators. Before we move into closed session, Madam Clerk, do we have any public comment on this item?
No, we do not.
Excellent. Okay, so we will move to conference room C and see folks back here after we have completed. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We are now returning to our study session, item number 2, Charter Amendment Study Session. And I believe we have a presentation from our City Attorney, Prasanna Rasaya. Thank you, Prasanna. Mr. Rasaya. Or Prasanna.
Well, good evening. I will try and move quickly since we have a regular council meeting beginning at 7 o'clock. So good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and Council and staff. So this is a follow-up from a council priority to examine a few different provisions of the charter relating to mayoral rotation, filling council vacancies, and also addressing our change to district elections. And staff has also proposed some what I'll call cleanup measures, which we'll get to in the presentation as well. And for the public, the charter is, of course, the city's constitution, as it were. And it was originally enacted in 1922. It's been amended over the years a number of times. There have been a number of attempts that have been unsuccessful. It was comprehensively rewritten in 1970, and then there was another comprehensive rewrite in 2002, actually. So with that, slides are not advancing. How do we advance them? Oh, there we go. So here are the questions for council. There's another duplicate slide at the end. So substantively, the question is, does the council agree with the proposed language on these items? And then there are procedural questions as well. One is splitting up the amendments into 2 different measures. One that are more in the nature of cleanup measures, such as reflecting the change to district elections, and others that I'll call more high-profile changes. And then also, does the council agree with the proposed schedule of council meetings and also with obtaining consultant assistance? There we go. So the first question, so on this slide is existing charter language, and what you see in bold is proposed language. So what I had heard from the council priority session was to look at how can we ensure that the council makes a decision at the first regular meeting in December. So this is one way to approach it. Now, with all of these changes, the council is, more than welcome to propose different language, to reject language, to say it looks acceptable. These are decisions for the council to make. And the proposed language is really a starting point for the council to consider. So the bold language indicates that the council would need to make a decision on selecting a mayor and deputy mayor without continuing that action to a future date unless there's one of 2 circumstances. One, there's unanimous vote. The council agrees that it should be continued to another meeting, or there's some emergency situation, such as, say there's an earthquake or a flood or something that imperils the ability of the council to actually make a decision. Say you're in disaster recovery mode. Now, there is a disadvantage to this approach, as I indicated in the staff report, which is that one council member could decide, no, we're going to decide this on the spot, and then just force the council to essentially stay there for a long time, which is really what happened last December. So that could be viewed as a disadvantage or an advantage, depending on how you look at it, right? Now, I'll also say that in terms of selecting a mayor, it's not that uncommon for councils sometimes to have trouble doing this. Sometimes, there are 2-2 votes. Maybe there's a vacancy. Maybe somebody's absent for whatever reason. This does happen from time to time. It's not that common, but it does happen. So this is something for the council to consider that we can come back to during the council questions and then council deliberation. Another approach is to look at the council guidelines and really, right now, there's discretion built in to disregard those guidelines. So you could remove that, but of course, these are just guidelines at the end of the day. So the council, could also disregard them, no matter what language you put in there, making that explicit. So moving on. Okay, so filling council vacancies. So I know there's a lot of words on the slide, but let's focus on the second bullet point. So you'll notice that there's a change from 30 to 60 days. So that's important just from a logistical and operational point of view, because 30 days is a really tight time frame to go through a process. Now it's been done. The council did it in December. But if you think about situations where, say, somebody's elected to a different office, that resignation is going to happen right around, mid-November, late November, and then you have to go through this process during the holiday season. Again, it can be done. 60 days is more common. 60 days is actually what's provided for in state law that applies to general law cities. So we thought that it was prudent to offer, at least for the council, a change to 60 days. Now, as far as the rest of the language is concerned, it takes out, as you can see, the power of the mayor to fill a vacancy. And it instead calls for the city clerk to call for a special election at once to fill the vacancy if the council can't agree. Now, the council could agree from the get-go and say, you know what, we already know that for whatever reason, based on the circumstances, we, the council, want to call for a special election on day 1, not day 30 or day 60. I mean, you could do that. I mean, if the council fails to agree, or for any other reason, you can choose to call a special election. Let's just say, a vacancy can occur not just where somebody's elected to a different office. Somebody may decide to move. Somebody may become disabled, may have a health problem. They may pass away. That happens. So, that could occur maybe early on in a council member's term. And the council may say, you know what, there's 3.5 years left in this person's term. That's a long time for somebody to be an appointee. We think it's appropriate, the council thinks it's appropriate to call a special election. So you could, there's some flexibility in there. Now, the language, both on the 30 days and on the power of the mayor to fill a vacancy, that actually comes from the 1922 charter, interestingly. It was there. I'm not aware, incidentally, of any other city that provides this power for the mayor. There may be some out there, but it's unusual for a city to provide this power to the position of the mayor. Oh, before I move on, there's a timing issue too, because a special election would need to occur during basically a set election time frame. So under state law, that would be, the state law provides for this in some detail. It's in either March or April or June or November. And it's either, it could be like the first or second, Monday or Tuesday. The state law is quite detailed. And so in a situation where, say, somebody's elected to a different office, and then the council decides to take 60 days, the full 60 days to make a decision, the city has to provide notice to the county to run an election. And we think that's 114 days, which applies both to general law cities, and there's another code section that we believe would apply to our situation. So what does that mean? That means in one situation, council has a vacancy, let's just say December 1st, to make it easy. 60 days, that's roughly February 1st, right? And then if you have to give 114 days notice to the county for the election could take place no earlier than 114 days from the date you call the election, then that could put you to November. But that's not the only scenario, though. You could have a different scenario where a vacancy comes up in, say, the summer. And so if you take maybe 30 days, maybe less, maybe more, up to 60, then the council could decide, you know what, we can't make a decision, let's throw it to a special election. It could be possible to have a special election in March or April or June. Now, there's some variables. Usually it's an even numbered years, not so much an odd numbered years. But there's different scenarios at play, but timing is most definitely a question. Now, cost is a question too. We've asked for the cost estimate from the county. We haven't gotten it yet. Oh, have we gotten it?
Based on 2022 for the November election, it was 168,000, right? 162,000. And we did just get if there's a special election cost from the county, and that ranged from 574,000 to 688,000.
Okay, so special election, upper 500,000s to upper 600,000s. It's a lot of money. So the point is, a council typically, when faced with that cost for a special election, will often make the appointment, because that's a pretty high cost burden for any city, well, for most cities. So there's cost and timing considerations wrapped up into the council vacancy question. I'll say one more quick thing about this. There was an attempt, let's see, in 1983, there was a ballot measure proposed to strip the mayor of having this power, and it failed. So it's been tried before. Just in case you're interested in the historical aspect of this. I thought it was interesting. Okay, so part two, this is a little simpler. The strike-through text, we're suggesting deleting because it addresses situations where, if you look at the first bullet point, you have a majority of the council that's become vacant, the seats have become vacant, and then the clerk calls a special election at once. That's where we got the language they plugged into the earlier slide. Calls a special election at once to fill the vacancy. So in that situation, you have multiple candidates running for multiple seats. And so in that case, it makes sense to have to say the person who gets the most votes gets the longer the unexpired term. But in this case, with district elections, that's not going to happen because you're running for one seat, not for multiple seats. So that's the reasoning. Okay, so for district elections, the first bullet point is pretty straightforward. The second bullet point just also makes it clear that when you have a special election, recall election, or appointment, that also has to be by district, meaning that the person who's going to fill that seat by whatever means also has to be from living in the district. And then finally, it also clarifies that, under the federal law in the U.S. Constitution, there's a census every 10 years. So every 10 years, we are going to redraw our boundaries as a result. And at other times, as provided by law, that's sort of a fail-safe language to provide flexibility. Say a court comes to the city and says, your existing council boundaries don't comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act or California Voting Rights Act, you need to redraw them. It provides for flexibility in that circumstance. Okay, so for the staff recommended amendments, I won't spend much time on this. First bullet point relates to language that just really isn't applicable anymore. Council terms were extended fall in 2017 due to state law that required us to realign our elections to even numbered years under certain circumstances. So we did that. But those council seats for those who were elected in 2015, 2017, those terms are over. The language isn't needed anymore. And the existing charter language provides for elections in even numbered years. Second, for urgency ordinances, it would allow publication of a summary. It's just a lot more convenient. It doesn't actually allow for that now. And then also it would delete language automatically repealing an urgency ordinance after 90 days. So this is kind of unusual too. Not aware of other cities that have this. It was a longstanding component of the charter, but it takes away a procedural hurdle, and the council can still repeal and should still repeal an ordinance if the urgency no longer exists. And then finally, this is an interesting one. There's from the 1922 charter, there is a lengthy set of requirements to provide a lot of background information, to provide one's photograph as part of really a filing with the city. And under a more recent amendment to that charter language, failure to follow this requirement does not result in disqualification. And the reasoning that we had as staff to propose deleting this is that the public doesn't commonly rely on information from the city in terms of what the city puts on the website for the candidate's background information. More typically, members of the public might go to the candidate's website, might go to the social media page, might look at the ballot guide where the candidate has an opportunity to explain who they are. This is language we're proposing to remove. It was from over 100 years ago. So we think it's unnecessary, but ultimately it's up to the council. So here's a schedule. It was in the packet, so I won't dwell on it. There are 2 more study sessions. We're suggesting third one if needed in February. Under state law, we need 2 public hearings, and then and only then could the council submit the measure to the voters. It has to be spread out, 21 days public hearing notice for each of the public hearings, and then they have to be spaced out, the 2 public hearings, that is, by 30 days. And we also want to build in a buffer so that 88 days before the election under state law is really the deadline. But we also want to be cooperative and provide the county plenty of time to include this with a proposed election, with the election in November 2024. So that's why we built in a bit of a buffer. So back to the questions for council. Do you agree on the substance? Do you propose? Would you like to suggest changes? And then procedurally, the questions are there. And then there's finally a separate question on council compensation. Would you like to direct staff to schedule a study session on council compensation at a future meeting? So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, City Attorney, for covering so many complicated topics in under 10 minutes in presentation. So kudos to you. Time for questions from council, please. Who would like to start? Councilmember Lorraine.
Thank you. Through the mayor. Prasanna, to your knowledge or staff's knowledge, has the city experienced an issue with filling a vacancy within the 30-day deadline, especially in the case of someone elected to another office? I guess I'm just a little surprised that we're talking about this tonight, because surely we've had other council members elected to other offices and around that November timeframe. And I guess I'm just curious if we ran into issues, or if it was just as you were noting, adopting maybe state language or more modern conventions.
It's really more the latter, just adopting more modern convention, because again, for general law cities, state law provides for a 60-day period. I believe also Redwood City has a 60-day period in its recent charter amendments. It just provides for more time to provide outreach to the public, to ask for applications. It's a little more deliberate, and it just allows for some more, I guess, logistical flexibility. Now, I'm not aware of any situations where it's actually been a problem or a legal problem. I'm not aware of situations where the council has been unable to fill a vacancy within 30 days. It's just that it's not the standard. Again, the 30 days was from the 1922 charter. So if you're going to amend this language, I would suggest adding on to that time to provide for 60 days consistent with what other jurisdictions in the county do. That's all.
Thank you. And I guess you brought up that a special election certainly could require more days notice beyond the 60 days and happen at a couple different points. And I guess I was just curious about how adhering, I guess, like to a 60-day deadline might impact an election-related vacancy on things like selecting board and liaison assignments. If we found ourselves in a position where we went through a rotation with 4 council members and expecting a 5th, and there was some time in between selecting that 5th, would some board and committee assignments be assigned to a council member to be appointed or elected later? Or I guess I'm just curious about what ramifications might exist with those sorts of delays.
Well, I mean, there could be, if you're asking whether doubling the time from 30 to 60 days would then have kind of a ripple effect on selecting, on other council actions that require identifying council members to fill certain roles in being a liaison to other boards and commissions, sure. Now that could happen, but again, I mean, the council doesn't need to take the full 60 days. It just provides the option so that if 30 days go by, say it takes 30 days, say it takes 35 days or 40 days, that's not going to run afoul of the charter. It just provides, really, it's nothing more than providing a little more flexibility.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Councilmember Hedges.
Yeah, one question I had was, what purpose would it be to not allow the urgency ordinance to lapse after 90 days? Seems like that would be the way to efficiently do it.
So are you asking whether we should, I'm not quite sure I'm following your question, whether we should change it or just leave it as is? Are you asking?
I think I'm saying just leave it as is.
If the council wishes, we can certainly leave it as is. It's been.
And I was
part of
asking why we wanted to change it.
Why would we want to change it? Well, I think in some circumstances, like during the pandemic, I believe we had to come, well, it's before my time here, but the city attorney's office, the staff had to come back to the council, I think more than once, to extend ordinances that otherwise would have expired within 90 days. Sometimes, my point is sometimes the urgency lasts for longer than 90 days. Okay. Not always, but sometimes it does. So then if you wanted to leave it as is, you certainly can. It just means that in those types of situations, whether it's a pandemic or an earthquake or wildfire, whatever it might be, staff might just have to come back to the council to renew an urgency ordinance for another period of time, another 90 days.
So, but the corollary would be if we take that out, then we would have to vote to take it out.
You would have to vote to, if you wanted to terminate an urgency ordinance, then yes. Then it would be at an appropriate time, once the urgency is ended, then the council could then terminate the ordinance because the underlying urgency no longer exists. It just means that the staff wouldn't have to bring it back while that urgent situation was still prevalent.
I see. Yeah, depending on the urgency, it might be difficult to bring it back.
I'm sorry, say it again?
Depending on the urgency, it might be difficult to bring it back.
It might be.
I mean, council people are ill.
Right.
Staff is ill, yeah.
Right. I mean, it was done during the pandemic, but in other situations, it might be more difficult. Something for the council to consider.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just offer a little perspective on that. It just created, I think this amendment would create more streamlining and be slightly less sort of administratively cumbersome when we're in the middle of managing an emergency. It creates a little less procedure, unnecessary procedure. Other questions from council members?
Through the mayor. Prasanna, as far as if we were to be opting in for having a special election, which it sounds like we would probably try to avoid, but if we were to do that, do we have to necessarily have a special election at a higher cost point, or could we defer it to the next? There was two prices that were kind of thrown out. One was $162,000. The other was $574 to $685. Could we say or put it in place that we'd wait for a more streamlined election so we'd be able to get it in at the $162,000 price, or do we have to follow the precedent and whenever it falls, whatever the special election cost is, that is what it is?
We could certainly look into that, but I guess the downside of doing that is that you would be going potentially for a much longer period of time for the next consolidated statewide election before actually filling that vacancy by a vote of the people. I think that's why we were proposing a special election, because then that way, if there's a council decision to actually turn that determination over to the voters, that it be done quickly. And it's also consistent with other language in the same charter provision.
Is there also a scenario where we would appoint someone and then when the next regularly scheduled election happened a year and a half later, they would come up, as opposed to having them wait for the end of the term that they were fulfilling? So, for example, if someone, was only 6 months into a term and had to leave, and then we brought someone else in, that the next election the following year, they would have to, go from being appointed to running? Or are we kind of locked in with it? I mean, you understand what I'm asking?
No, I understand what you're asking. That's something we could also look into if that's the direction of the council. It just means that you would only have an appointee for potentially a pretty limited period of time. But I think the clerk's office may have some input on this question.
We had a situation like this when Rick Bonilla was appointed originally to Robert Ross's old term. And he did the appointment to the next election, and then he ran for a 2-year short term for the seat, and then he ran for a 4-year seat. So he had like a year and a half.
You actually have precedent for that.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. As far as other potential changes, one of the things that I've talked about with Alex is just removing the date and time of council meetings clause, which would give us the flexibility that if instead of doing it on a Monday, we wanted to do it on a Tuesday, or instead of starting at 6:30, which I think is what it's in writing, it has to start, no earlier than 6:30. If we just removed that clause altogether, it would give us flexibility.
Yes.
Is this the appropriate forum to talk about that? Or, okay.
Yeah, so, no, that's fine. And if I can manage to work the PowerPoint.
One of the things we've talked about, several of us, is that with, coming out of COVID and more people attending meetings now online, there's definitely the opportunity to start meetings earlier because people can participate without having to be here. And so just removing that clause gives us some flexibility. Likewise, it gives us flexibility if we wanted to have a meeting at a different site, it kind of removes that. Or is that a different clause? I'm not sure.
Okay, so Martin to the rescue to help me with this. So, no, that's, okay. Okay, so this is the language in the charter at issue. Originally, so yes, this is the appropriate time to talk about it, and if the council directs, you can certainly have language in a ballot measure saying the time shall be as specified by ordinance. You can certainly do that. Actually, I think Redwood City has that, and it does provide for more flexibility. It's really up to the council. And, the language in the 1922 charter actually stated a time of 8 p.m. On the first and third Monday of each month. And in 2002, it was, now I've learned so much about like the history of the charter here.
8 o'clock.
And in 2002, this was actually changed from 8 p.m. to no earlier than 6:30 p.m. So it was changed fairly recently, but there's certainly logic to just saying, just decide by ordinance. And if that's the direction of the council, we can add that.
You're saying fairly recently, but wasn't it 20 years ago? 21 years ago?
In
I mean,
the
I guess it's
larger-
fairly
in-
recent, it's less than 100 years, but it's still not that recent.
In the larger scheme of things, like 20 years ago and legal epochs, like it's not that long ago.
Sorry, thank you. I think I have one more question. One thing that we've talked about as well, a few of us, with commissions and board members, is that if there's verbiage in the charter that says if we would like to remove a commissioner, we need a 4-person vote out of 5, as opposed to a 3-person vote out of 5. And to me, that just seems odd because on the same token, if we wanted to remove someone from being the mayor, we only need 3 votes, which again, to me, it seems lopsided. And so I'd like to know a little more, and it doesn't have to be tonight, but I would like to know a little bit more about why that's in place and what the thoughts are around it.
Okay, so here's the charter language at issue. And you're right, it says majority of the council plus 1. Now, at a previous council meeting, I had heard a few council members indicate, I think I heard, a lack of interest in changing this. Doesn't mean you can't change your mind. This is something that I think would generate some more public interests versus, say, change to district elections or some of the cleanup language. But if the council wants to direct staff to propose altering this language to the voters and just say a majority of the council, that's up to the council to provide that direction.
Okay. And I think that's all my questions. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor?
Thank you, City Attorney. Let me bring this in a little bit. Okay, thank you very much. I also thank you for being able to consolidate all of us. So, let's see. In terms of the mayoral selection rotation, did you and other members of staff consider just doing an automatic rotation, as some cities do, as opposed to saying that the council has to decide?
That's something that we didn't discuss a lot, sort of at a staff level, but that's something the council could direct staff to make it more sort of an automatic, formulaic process. We'd have to consider how to put that in the charter and also in the council guidelines. But, I see the city clerk has some input.
And we do have all the steps in the council guidelines for the mayor rotation. And every year I provide a spreadsheet of how the next person goes in line. So we have some guidelines, some rules around that right now.
Right, so the council guidelines do have a formula that's built in that results in a list of council members and who would be otherwise next in line to be, mayor and deputy mayor. And if you wanted us to come back to, instead of this language, to just make it purely formulaic and remove all discretion to the extent we can, then we can come back with that.
Yeah.
If that's the direction of the council majority.
Okay, great. Well, we can talk about that later, but thank you very much. Let's see, then. Did I hear correctly? You said we're the only city you're aware of that currently the mayor in San Mateo has the power to fill that 5th vacancy, that no other city around here does that?
Well, correct. So the only other charter city in San Mateo County, Robert City, does not have that language in their charter. And the rest of the cities, they rely on the general law, which to fill a vacancy, again, it's taking 60 days to do it. And then if they can't decide, then setting a special election. There's a great deal of detail in the state law, but that's what it boils down to.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the verified statement of candidates, does any other city do that, or are we the only ones?
I think we're the only ones in the county, but I have not researched that specific question.
Yeah, okay. As long as we all believe in the power of the internet, then we can do something else. And then in the packet, it talks about for the process and the schedule, that there would be a recommended community polling to see if the community was in favor of some of the major recommendations if we did a charter?
Yes.
How would that work?
Well, we would hire, and perhaps I don't know if the city manager, the city clerk has any input on this, since I think our city manager's prior jurisdiction went through this recently, but I think that would most definitely be needed in order to gauge the public sentiment on proposed ballot measure changes, because I think in proposing something to the voters, you want to propose something that we think has an actual chance of passing. And, if the council is going to group more high-profile changes in one measure, then it's useful to know if one particular change is going to have the effect of dragging down the acceptability of that measure. So I think polling would be essential in addition to having a ballot measure consultant, but perhaps the city manager has more to add.
I would concur with the city attorney. So best practice would be is one to poll, especially if you're going to have multiple measures, one that might be a little bit more politically contentious versus one that is just cleaning up some of the language within the charter. Additionally, you'd want to, with that polling, if we're looking at, say, with the general plan heights measure, you'd also want to actually tease that out too as part of the overall. So you could try to figure out your slate of ballot measures and how people react to all of that. Additionally, you're going to want to do education and information. So that's where the ballot measure consultant or could help out, not only just the survey consultant, so that we can articulate and to educate people about the measures that we're contemplating, proposing to place on the ballot. And so what would happen is after we do all that engagement and communication, we would come back with a package for the council's consideration whether or not they would want to place these charter amendments or measures on the general plan for the November 2024 ballot.
Thank you. And one of the outcomes of that polling could be that you might want to change the way that it might be 3 charter amendment as opposed to 2. That could be.
That is correct.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you, Prasanna. So I guess I just wanted to ask again about the timeline, the potential timeline for a vacancy to be filled, because I think it's really important to have a fully operational legislative body, and so if I'm doing the math correctly and I'm looking at the proposed language, we're talking about increasing the maximum number of days for the council to fill the vacancy. It's from 30 to 60, so that's 2 months, right? And then at that point, potentially calling for a special election, which would have a noticing requirement of 114 days. And then that 114 days needing to align with the designated dates that we are able to hold elections. So at a minimum, we're talking about maybe 8 months, but possibly 11 months.
Well, I think it depends on when the vacancy occurs, but suffice it to say, It would be several months, I think, under most scenarios.
Several months, more than 6 months, by all estimations.
Well, there's the 114-day minimum notice, yes, and then it depends on how long the council would take to actually fill a vacancy, if they take the full 60 days or not. If you add the two together for the 174 days, then yes, it could be that amount of time.
Okay, and just to put a pin on it in terms of like the cost, the built-in cost of syncing with an existing election, which is significantly less, under $200,000, or holding a special election. So if we were to try to save, $100,000, that could push the timeline even more. Not $100,000. If we are going to try to save $500,000, right? Then we could, we would be looking at a vacancy for maybe a year and a half, potentially.
So I would be looking at the 114 days, plus you have the 60 days, and where you're looking at, I believe it's 4 times a year where you could have a special election per the county's office. So I don't see it taking that long in time. I actually went through this whole experience of the policy that is before you when I was in Redwood City just 2 years ago. And so typically, the way I saw it all work out is that because the cost of an election is so expensive, typically councils, they're going to rely on hopefully making an appointment in those situations. 30 days would not be enough time to do a really good job of being able to go out and ask the community members to apply for the vacancy. I saw that happen in Redwood City. They didn't take the full 60 days, but believe it took about probably 40 days to actually seat the new appointed council member at the time. And it's limited term, basically. For that council member, they just serve the rest of the period. But not a year and a half, I guess, Mayor.
Okay, so not a year and a half. I guess I think it helps us to quantify a little bit more clearly in terms of like several months, because that, in terms of our ability to do the people's business, days matter, right? And making it more clear in this conversation what we're potentially talking about in terms of the timeline of being, of being a 4-person council and what the potential impacts would be. I would ask that we get our language a little bit clearer in this conversation about what that potential timeline could be.
Really, I would say it's probably about 6 months if you really look at it. If we're doing it, staff would come back just like we have a timeline just for this entire charter amendment, right? We would basically provide it all kind of timed out as to allow, just depending on when the announcement is made. But you'd look at the 60 days and then another 114 days technically. And then just looking at with the 4 times a year, you're probably looking right at that probably 6, maybe 7 months. If I'm doing my math correctly and thinking about the calendar.
Again, I want to just emphasize, thank you, Mr. City Manager. No, I want to just emphasize the cost deterrent too. I know Alex mentioned this too, but yes, the timeline is a real possibility and something the council needs to be fully aware of. But usually, or I guess often, the councils will look at the cost of a special election and say, no, we want to save that money for something else and then choose somebody, within maybe a slightly more flexible time period of up to 60 days. But yes, it most definitely could happen where a council could decide to have a special election. I think realistically it's less likely, but still possible.
Okay. And then I just was interested to learn more about the Measure C in 1983. As was mentioned, San Mateo is unique, and for over 100 years, the mayor has the power to fill the vacancy. And then in 1983, according to your deep dive, you uncovered that there was an attempt to change that, which failed. So I was just wondering if you had any more information on that.
Well, first I have to give kudos to the city clerk who uncovered that, and, I didn't independently research that, so, yay for Patrice. But really, we don't have the ballot measure materials from 1983, so I don't have any additional insight into the arguments that were presented, if there were any arguments presented for and against. But, it did fail, not by a huge margin, but, it was not successful. I'm not aware of any other time when that particular change was proposed to the voters. I think it was only in 1983 that the language was proposed to be changed. So we are left with it today.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's open up to public comment. Madam Clerk, do we have any commenters?
I'm checking for raised hands. I do have a raised hand. Seema Patel, please go ahead.
Good evening, City Council. My name is Seema Patel. I currently serve on the Planning Commission, but I'm speaking on my own behalf tonight. I just wanted to make one comment on the language surrounding the first meeting after a general election. As I recall from the events of last November, there were some people who were arguing that the language saying that new members had to be seated and then the mayor would be elected, that the new members were referring to both members who had just been elected, but also members who needed to be appointed. And so to prevent that confusion or argument from happening again, I would just suggest that you clarify that language to indicate that it only applies to members who were just elected. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no other hands raised.
Thank you. With that, we'll close public comment. And who would like to start with deliberation? Councilmember Hedges.
Well, let me start by saying I don't have a problem with extending the time to 60 days. I do have a problem with the language around how you select a mayor. I've had a long-standing belief that it should be a simple rotation, not only for the mayor, but for the chairs of the various boards and commissions. And I can tell you why. I can cite you 3 instances with Gumminger, Eric Rodriguez, Dorothy Chow, where they were denied either the chair of one of the boards or commissions, or in Gumminger's situation, the mayor. And in each of those instances, it was a political denial. I want to get beyond politics. I want this to be a simple rotation and let the chips fall where they may based on seniority. I feel that the people I know, and actually Gumminger's still alive, and he's still very sore about missing out on being mayor. And I know the other, Dorothy is not alive, but she was not angry. She was very sad that she was denied. And she's such a sweet lady, she should not have been made sad over this issue. So I'm landing very clearly where the question was asked by the vice mayor, that why are we not doing this? Because it pretty much usually works out that way anyway. So I have no problem with the urgency ordinance, the 90 days being taken out. I don't have any problem with taking out 6:30. However, I don't know how you would get here any earlier. 5 o'clock today. Depending on the bridge. And I think I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Other comments?
Thank you. I'm going to try to start by getting as much that I agree with out of the way as possible. I think it's safe to say to the first bullet here, I am okay with the language proposed by staff addressing everything except the mayoral rotation. With regard to the procedures, I think I agree with everything staff is recommending. With regard to the the mayoral rotation language proposal, I'm concerned that as written, it still puts council in potentially the same exact position that we found ourselves in December. And I think one of the main ideas behind this conversation is to move beyond that, and we don't, we need a mayoral rotation that cannot be delayed indefinitely. So how can we accomplish that? I appreciate the question that the deputy mayor brought up about potential, something of like an automatic rotation. I think, as Councilmember Hedges said, that strikes me as a fair way of fixing this. And I would be curious to hear from other council members if they have issues or concerns with it, or if I'm missing something that would be a drawback to that proposal. I was considering something else, but I think I like that better. So at the moment, I'm kind of, I would say I'm interested in that or something else if the deliberations take us in a direction that shows that there's an issue that maybe wasn't considered before with that particular proposal. I think overall, I think I agree with what I feel like I heard in the conversation about the idea that it could benefit the council to have 60 days as opposed to 30 days to consider filling a vacancy, and that indeed, given the cost of elections, it would be generally in the interest of a council to instead appoint somebody and try to engage the community in a process in which people apply and one of them could be selected so that we can continue the city's business while saving important dollars for the people's business. I did want to mention that I believe we should schedule a separate study session item on council compensation in the future. And I guess on the subject of changing the time of meetings, at the moment I'm neutral on it. I think, I guess I don't have a strong feeling about it, so I'm open to continued council deliberation on that. And I do think it's important just for a moment to remember that, I appreciate us having this conversation tonight. And, this is where and when we should have started this conversation, not on December 5th, 2022. At that time, we had 2 new council members who did not have a majority go against the council guidelines, described earlier as essentially our city's constitution. They went against precedent and the expectations of city staff and the previous council. It delayed and disrupted the city's business. It wasted hours of hundreds of people's time. And it disrespected a sitting council member, the only one who had served before that date. That was wrong. And I'm hoping that at the end of our deliberations tonight, we can come up with a solution that will prevent it from happening again. Thank you.
And just to clarify quickly that I mentioned the city charter is the city's constitution. The guidelines are different and, under its own terms can be disregarded, but I also understand your vote.
I appreciate that clarification and would withdraw that portion of my statement. Thank you.
Thank you through the mayor. Going through the various items here in the order of the staff report, I do think that doing an automatic rotation for the reasons that Councilmember Hedges and Councilmember Lorraine have mentioned makes a lot of sense, and would look to staff coming back with whatever detail we would need to focus on. I also have no problem with removing the not earlier than 6:30, unless staff comes back and says there is some real problem with that. I think having some flexibility is a good idea. Let's see. I agree with Councilmember Lorraine that we should have a future a study session on council compensation. I certainly agree with expanding the 30 days to 60 days, because if only in the interest of not putting our staff through lots of jumps in a very short period of time, and hopefully having more opportunity to get out to the public and get more people to apply. I think the idea of removing the mayor's power to appoint makes sense, and the process here going 60 days and calling a special election, particularly given the fact that we're the only charter city in the peninsula or the county that does it this way right now. And if it's general law throughout the state and it hasn't been a huge issue up and down the state, then I think we've got some precedent there to take a look at. Then the district election language, absolutely, clean it up. 2017, yes, get rid of that. Emergency ordinance, I agree that we should get rid of the having to revote in 90 days. I agree with the mayor's comments that it just added something that was unnecessary. Verified statement of candidates, I go based on staff's recommendation to take it out. So I'll leave that. And I support the proposed schedule. And yeah, absolutely, we need to do community polling, no question. So I think that, and splitting the amendments into 2 ballot measures, I would agree with, unless the community polling comes back and says we should do something different. And I agree with the schedule of council meetings and community outreach and obtaining consultant assistance in polling.
I'm having trouble with the button today, sorry. Through the mayor. First, just kind of going through. I also would like to have more information about just having the simple rotation in place, automatic rotation. I know that's been brought up, and I agree with all my colleagues on that. Agree with most, I think all the other changes for the first bullet point. As far as procedurally splitting the amendment in 2, yes. Schedule of council meetings, I think it would be good. It doesn't mean we necessarily will start meetings earlier. It just gives us leeway to be able to do so. And I don't think there's anything wrong with having a little more flexibility there. Interesting that it went from 8 o'clock to 6:30. That, and I was wondering, did you not vote in the 1983 election, Rich? You don't remember what happened?
I voted. I remember.
Yeah.
Actually,
All right.
I was on the 2002
We can't hear you.
committee.
Sorry.
I was on the 2002 committee that redid the.
Got it. He's the only one. He's the only one I know that was here and voting. I was.
The only one who remembers Gummager.
Let's see. Community outreach, absolutely, we should do that and use the polling. Obtain consultant assistant, yes, to all those. Am I missing anything?
The future study session on council compensation, or you?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's do that. Thank you.
Councilmember Hedges?
I left a couple things out that I actually had written down. So on changing the boards and commissions for 4 out of 5 to 3, I would be against that because it's usually used as a political weapon. The city attorney and the city manager, it would take 4 city council members to remove them. Those are obviously for political reasons. Can you imagine removing a library board member because of their choice or position on a book? That's going on all over the country except for here. So I think that staying with 4 votes to remove somebody, you can ask me if there's anybody I would remove. I'd probably say yes, but it would be for political reasons, and I don't agree to do that for political reasons. So, and then on compensation, I don't care if we have a separate meeting on it. I'm not necessarily in favor of changing it, but I'm willing to listen to everybody else.
Okay. Thank you. I will weigh in as well, and it sounds like we largely agree on most of the items. So I would say I agree with the proposed charter amendments. I'm open to codifying the mayoral rotation in the city charter. I share Councilmember Lorraine's concern for the proposed amendments in terms of this election and timing of this election as not being as foolproof as it could be. Disallowing continuation is, it doesn't, I don't know if that's as strong language as we need, given what our history and what has happened. And so I'm interested to hear if there are ways that we can bolster that language even further. In terms of, filling the vacancy, I'm looking at the sort of the national landscape as we're in this local government context. And the headline in New York Times article today, the House has entered its second week without a speaker, and it's devolved into complete chaos. And so, as we're discussing a potential timeline of having, potentially in the worst case scenario, a deadlocked council with 2-2 votes, it could significantly impair, this legislative body could be significantly impaired by a vacancy. And my interest in serving on this organization is to continue doing the city's business and the people's business. And so any prolonged timeline that could potentially impair the city from making very important, critical decisions that serve community, whether I agree with them or disagree with them, frankly, I think that having prolonged periods of time with with vacancies, I want to raise as a very real concern that I hold. So whether the mayor is in place or not, frankly. So I appreciate our city attorney who confirmed that there's nothing disallowing the council from immediately calling a special election if we feel like there potentially could be a deadlock vote. That sort of that option remains available. I do consider the administrative realities of filling a vacancy, and I'm not opposed to extending the timeline to make, to ease the burden on staff, from 30 to 60 days. I think my concern is the potential of creating a system however, standard it is in general law cities, we are not a general law city, right? And we're only comparing ourselves to one other city if we're now talking about other models, which is not a lot to go on. So, the idea of setting up a system where we are giving ourselves from 30 days to 60 days, and then on top of that, 114 days required notice, and then on top of that, trying to sync with the election dates, potentially, according to our city manager, that could look like 60 days of a vacancy on council. And in my term on council, there have been important issues that have been 3-2. I know that the city clerk has looked at some of the history of split votes and deadlock votes, which has happened over the years, and so. Putting politics aside, which I think is what we are called to do in moments like this, I worry about us setting up a system that in its worst case scenario could leave a district unrepresented for half a year. People unrepresented for half a year. I know how traumatic it was for the city to go without representation for 7 days. So imagine what can happen for 6 months and the number of important decisions that take place in that 6-month period. So I have really strong reservations about, about the idea of the 60-day window and then a special election. I think, one option would be at the first meeting following the council vacancy, the council decides whether to hold a special election, yes or no. And then if we decide not to, then it would default to the language that has been in place for over 100 years, which is that we would go through an appointment process through an extended period of time to now 60 days. And if at that point a decision can't be made, then the mayor decides. And that is the language that has worked in this city for over 100 years. And actually there was an attempt to change it, and it failed. And so looking at who we are as a city and, and potentially looking at even building in a system of rotation that is codified as written in stone as it can be, it would provide, a level of equilibrium and representation to every single person. And it would not become politicized, it would not become weaponized. The opportunity for exploitation and extortion would be non-existent. And so, those are some of the potential considerations I would like to raise in this conversation regarding the timing of mayoral rotation and the timeline for filling vacancies and the methodology. So I'll move on to some of the other things. I totally agree with the amendments for district elections and the other administrative changes. I'm, somewhat agnostic about changing the timeline or the start time for our meetings. But I do agree that having flexibility is an advantage. And maybe there's a way that we can build that into council guidelines and a standard process that that can be reviewed at periodic periods that is directly referred to in the charter, so that there's a clear thread there. I definitely agree with splitting the amendments into 2 ballot measures, and of course support community engagement and the proposed scheduled meetings. I absolutely want to see us engage a polling consultant and have robust polling. And on the record, I do not want to entertain changes to how we remove commissioners. I'm not interested in that. And am I missing anything? I think that covered.
Oh, the council compensation.
Council compensation, yes, I would be interested in bringing that back as well. Thank you. Councilmember Hedges.
Yeah, I was thinking as the mayor spoke about, I was sort of in the middle on the mayor not being able to make appointments. I really believe now they should. And in comparing Redwood City to San Mateo, there's one big difference. They have a 7-member council. It's much less likely for it to end into a 3-3 tie. So I think with the number of our council members, unless we're going to increase them and increase the districts, then I think that we leave it as it is to avoid eventually having to get to a special election with that kind of cost. So what happened this year is unusual in the city. The last time it happened was in the 90s, and hopefully we'll go another 30 years before it happens again. But I agree with the mayor on this point. I had not brought it up because I was sort of didn't care one way or the other, but I do care now.
So just to be clear, you would want to leave the vacancy provision as is, except you're fine with changing it from 30 to 60 days?
No, I'm fine with leaving the mayor making the appointment.
Okay. And then in terms of having a 60-day period.
I'm good at 60 days. I said that earlier. Yeah.
Yes, please.
I also appreciated the mayor's comments, and I think it enriched the conversation regarding the trade-offs between the current provision for allowing the mayor to appoint a council member versus what's being proposed tonight. But I think I am still interested in pursuing the staff's recommendation on this. I think the mayor brings up a good point in that, like, we with the option for the mayor to appoint somebody, we effectively the council effectively avoids putting itself in a situation where it needs to call special elections. This can save us money and time and decision making. However, I think I thought anecdotally to the last time this council had to fill a vacancy, which was not that long ago, and thankfully did not go to needing a tiebreaker. In that situation, the council did deliberate. They deadlocked a couple of times on votes, but the mayor at the time, and I don't want to speak for the exact reasonings why a vote was changed, but I on that night a vote was changed and a member, someone was appointed to fill the vacancy. I feel that, like, it's possible that decision was made in the interest of avoiding the council getting into a situation in which a mayor was forced to make a tiebreaker decision and appoint somebody, for some of the reasons that have been discussed tonight, in that it can be seen as politically too favorable to one faction over another, perhaps, if you will. Additionally, of course, there was an interest in filling the vacancy in a timely manner so that we could continue the city's business. And I guess from that experience, I wonder, I believe that that possibility would exist with the staff's proposal, in that I think it's fair to say, if we have this, a rotation that is, expected, that allows each member of council to become a mayor, and that process is not necessarily disrupted too often, then it falls to one member of I think that all council members would, even if they found themselves in a group of four, understand that the interest is in appointing a council member more often than not to allow for the council to continue the city's business in a timely manner with a full legislative body and avoid a special election. So I feel like in either possibility, the body, I think, is generally interested in avoiding running out the clock and figuring out the ultimate backdrop option. And so I am optimistic that the staff's proposal would not necessarily take away that interest, but it would take some tension and focus away from one particular council member and the potential power or extra authority that decision would make or have.
Can I ask a question, understanding that we're now at kind of 7:04? Are you can certainly change your mind at a future study session, but at this point, are you more in favor of what the draft language that was presented to the council, or are you saying you want to keep the existing language, reserving to the mayor the power to make an appointment?
I would prefer the draft proposal from staff.
Okay.
Any additional thoughts or clarifications from council? Please.
Just curious, when we look at a city like Redwood City, it's got 20,000 less residents than we do. In the East Bay, Hayward is pretty close to the same size as us, maybe 5,000 or 10,000 more people. San Leandro is about 10,000 people less than us. Why do we not consider having more? I mean, obviously there's a logistical part to it, but why don't we consider having a council of 7 as opposed to 5? I mean, was there thought put into that when we went to districts last year, or?
I think this is the way that council has been set up since its inception, and different cities make a different calculation. They decide some cities are fine with 5, others with 7, some are fine with 9.
So it's just always been that way?
I think it's always been that way, and undoing it, making a change, that would be a pretty big lift, not only for the charter, but also for district.
And by no means am I suggesting that.
Okay.
I'm just more curious.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we would not have enough space on the dais and so, just joking aside. Councilmember Hedges, did you have?
Yeah, just a comment to that. I actually made a proposal during the time we were going through. I sent it in that we have 5 council members and an at-large mayor, and if that is 3-3, then we would have maybe a 6th district, which actually would have made it a little easier to do the districts, because it would have been about 15,000 per district. So it's not beyond the pale that we could expand at one time. I'm still very much in favor of a citywide mayor elected, because it kind of knits the city together.
Maybe that's a conversation for another time, maybe for.
Just to offer this comment.
Okay. City Attorney, do you have what you need from us? Are we
Yes.
clear?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So in the interest of time, we will end our study session, and I think we need 10 minutes for, to get set up for the next meeting, so we will meet back here at 7:15.
Just to clarify also, the special meeting is just being paused, and then the last item for the special meeting regarding the Zoom bombing and hate speech will be paused until after the end of the regular meeting.
Thank you for the clarification. We are not